My name is Elle, and I'm a transgender woman talking about how I know I'm transgender. I am doing kind of an ongoing series. This is part 4 now of the series that asks the question, am I transgender? It's a question that a lot of us who are trans ask ourselves. Some of us are able to grow up in home environments where a gender expansive expression and behavior is safe and allowed, and so kids are able to explore their gender with a little bit less shame than some of us who are adults. But a lot of us, especially those of us who transition as adults, we found ourselves asking these questions, am I transgender, later into life, whether it's later into our teens, into our young adulthood, or on. And I know for me, I've asked this question many times over the course of my life, and I've had many different sort of glimpses and answers along the way. And some of the things I've talked about in the previous parts of this series, Am I Transgender, have been things like looking at some of these items as individual isolated things, in which case they're more easily able to be explained away versus looking at them collectively or as a whole. I've talked some about my preoccupation with trans people and the idea of transition and so on. I've talked about my feelings of despair and feeling trapped. Talked about prayers that I've had over the years, praying before I go to sleep at night, or praying before I blow out my birthday candles, asking to wake up with a different body, with a different life, having magical thinking, thinking about the Matrix pill test. I talked I think in part 3 about gender expansive expressions that I had over the course of the years. And so all of these things have been a part of answering that question for me. And so I'm going to continue on with that this week and name some more items. I'm spacing these out because I don't think that you want Am I Transgender, this series to be every week, but I do want to get it on record, and I have a lot of items for me, and I did a lot of work putting this together for myself, just to be clear. And so I want to share it, not only because it's important to me and it's a part of my story, but also in hopes of potentially helping other people to sort of discover, am I trans or am I not, and I know that for me, one of the things that was really powerful when I was asking myself that question seriously and was trying to figure out the answers to it, was that hearing other people give their answers and to hear them say things that I had thought about or had very directly experienced, it was really powerful and really impactful. So Am I Transgender, Part 4. We're going to go pretty quick today. I have quite a number of items that I want to get to, so we're going to blast through them really quick instead of trying to savor on any one of them. One of the items on my list is the mirror. The mirror. Over the years, I've looked at myself in the mirror. But more than that, I've looked at myself in the mirror and thought many different things at many different times. That there were many times when I looked at myself in the mirror and looked at my face and thought, I kind of have a pretty face. Maybe I could be a girl. I wonder if I should have been a girl, or wonder if I could have been, or what if I transitioned? Could I be a girl? I've looked at, the body that I have, which is pretty large. I'm 6'1" and over 250 pounds. I'm a very big human being, just in general. I'm big for a man and very big for a woman. But I've always looked at my body in the mirror and not liked it, and wished that it was smaller, wished that it was more, just less bruising and more delicate, but that's how it is. I have many memories of seeing the hair that I used to have pretty much everywhere, that thank God is mostly gone now. And of course, genitals has been a part of that for many, many years since I was a little kid. Seeing what I had and wishing that it was different. Just not to get too graphic, but that has been a big part of how I know I'm trans. I don't think that it's a terribly normative experience. Of course, people, this kind of goes into the difference between body dysphoria and body dysmorphia. And the nuanced difference is that with body dysphoria or with gender dysphoria, the things about our physical selves that we don't like them because of how gender is associated with them or not. Whereas with gender or with body dysmorphia, it's like, well, I don't like this finger. This finger, I don't want it. I just don't want it. It has to do with something else other than gender. The reason that my large body and the hair and the genitals and all that kind of, the reason those things have bothered me is because of the way that people read gender into them, and because of the way that my gender was incorrectly understood because of them. It's part of what made it part of what made it gender dysphoria. So that's one. Another one has to do with disassociation and emotional austerity. Now, again, this, and I guess like any of these, taken as an individual, we could reason any of them away. But again, for me, it's hard to not come to the conclusion that I'm trans when I look at all of them together. And I think that in total, I have 20 some items. We're going to get up to item number 9 or 10 this week, or maybe 11. But I lived a lot of my life disassociated from myself, disassociated from what I wanted, disassociated from what I felt. And there's a certain degree to which the masculine gender roles, or the masculine gender role, prescribes this for us. I think that there's a certain amount of emotional austerity that is expected of men who are in that role. But I also think, and that was certainly true for me, I took on and played that role, and I did so quite consciously in order to better pass as a man, because it felt really, really dangerous and scary for anyone to see anything feminine in me, because I wasn't ready to see that, and I was scared that other people would see it, and so I tried to show up, or I tried to really walk that tightrope. But I think that in many ways, for many years, I was very shut down emotionally and very unable to feel very much. I felt a lot of anger. A lot of times I felt rage sometimes. I felt a certain degree of happiness and joy. It depended on the time. But there was a lot of just blah. And it's interesting, when I finally admitted to my psychiatrist, this was before I came out to my wife, when I finally admitted to her that I really needed to explore my gender in an honest way, this emotional release just began. And it really hasn't stopped in the 3 or so years since then, or maybe a little bit more than 3 years. It hasn't stopped. And it's been absolutely amazing the way that being honest about my gender, and certainly, telling my wife and coming out to other people in my life and diving into it more deeply, it's been amazing how facing that part of myself and coming to understand it and accept it and love it and sense God's love, sometimes through other people, the way that opened up my heart, and it opened up all kinds of emotional availability that I hadn't had. I've cried more in these last years than I have in my whole life. Even before I got on estrogen, it was profound, the emotional shift away from being disassociated from my inner life to being able to acknowledge it and express it and own it. And the process of looking at my gender was the turning point that opened the key to that. So that's another one. One of the ways that I know that I'm trans, seeing how that changed. I've talked a little bit in the past about grief and how transition is a grief. And that's certainly true. There are a lot of things looking back on my life that I feel great grief for. Not being able to be pregnant, for example, not being able to carry a child. I treasure the children that I have, that I was able to create with my wife, and so my grief about not being able to have a pregnancy has nothing to do with my kids. Like I don't want more. Like I want my kids, and I certainly wouldn't want to deprive my wife of that experience either. So it's a little bit of a funny thing. But there's grief there from not having that experience. A lot of experiences of girlhood that I grieve. I mean, obviously there's some that are dark and unwanted, and I certainly wouldn't wish for those. But things like going to Disney and having a princess dress, and going to school dances like prom, and wearing formal clothes, and going clothes shopping with girlfriends. Honestly, in junior high and high school, lots of those gendered type experiences that I didn't get to be part of. And like I said, I mean, obviously there's downsides, but there's a lot of grief that goes along with that. And just, the fact that grief is there for me points to the fact that I'm a trans person. It points to the fact that my heart is a feminine heart, and that something inside of my brain and my soul knows that I'm a woman. A trans lady that I really respect and that I've loved reading her work is Julia Serrano. I've talked about her some on the program before, but she writes about this in her book Whipping Girl, and I want to read an extended quote about this grief. She writes, "Unlike most forms of sadness that I've experienced, which inevitably ease with time, my gender dissonance only got worse with each passing day. And by the time I made the decision to transition, my gender dissonance had got so bad that it was completely consuming me. It hurt me more than any pain, physical or emotional, that I'd ever experienced. I know that most people believe that transsexuals transition because we want to be the other sex, but that is an oversimplification. After all, I wanted to be female almost my whole life, but I was far too terrified of the label transsexual or having potential regrets to seriously consider transitioning. What changed during that 20-some year period was not my desire to be female, that had been with me all along, but rather my ability to cope with being male, to cope with my own gender dissonance. When I made the decision to transition, I honestly had no idea what it would be like for me to live as female. The only thing I knew for sure was that pretending to be male was slowly killing me." And, I find a lot of resonance in this passage, and it, for me, it goes both ways. Actually, one of the tasks that my therapist had me do early on was write out, almost doing, like in therapy we have like the magic question or the magic wand question, where we invite our clients to sort of paint a picture of the world that they want, or that they imagine that they want. And so she asked me to do that when it came to gender. And so I wrote pretty extensively about what if I were living my life as a woman, what her life would be like. And there were lots of things that were the same in this ideal vision. And there were lots of things that were, different or adjusted, or just with a different feel altogether. And that experience highlighted for me sadness, but it also highlighted for me the sadness and the grief of being stuck in a body and in a role that I didn't want. It was foreign to me, that was painful to exist in. And so this, weird interplay, this deep, incredible grief and sadness for not being able to, have certain experiences and live that way, while also being stuck with these other ones that I didn't want in the first place, that tells me I'm trans. I have about 3 more in the episode today. Another one of them has to do with suffering. And this really came out as I was, in the process of deciding what to do. I had, at least for me, I had come to the conclusion that yes, I'm trans. But what therefore should I do? There's an episode early on that I did, Should I Transition? And it talks a lot about this dynamic. But, so I have this self-identification. Well, what do we need to do about it? I mean, if you talk with conservative Christians, they would say, well, you shouldn't do anything because it's wrong. I just watched a video on Twitter of the president of the Adventist Church, which is the church that I was a part of for a lot of years, just railing about LGBTQ people and how we, as those of us who identify as Christian, are twisting the Bible and blah, blah, blah. And what we really need to do is become converted, right? So sort of implying this idea that, it's okay to, to admit these identifications. It's okay to want to, have a romantic relationship with someone who's the same gender or the same sex, but you shouldn't do anything about it. And what you really need to do is you need to get converted. You need to go to conversion therapy and get changed, even though we know that is abusive and traumatic and harmful, and it breaks down really quick, doesn't it? So during that time, when I was trying to figure out what I should do, I started to kind of compile what was likely to happen in terms of suffering, right? And so it was really important to me to sort of evaluate the risks and the rewards, and I was confident at that point. I had done enough, kind of playing around and experimenting and whatever, and talking with other trans people and so on, to sort of trust that transition was going to be helpful to me, probably, and that there were going to be good things that would come. There's this wonderful meta-analysis of the literature by Cornell University. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, and I think I probably put a link to it before. It's an article called What We Know, and it's this extended explanation of all the different scientific studies on the effectiveness of gender transition for trans people in treating gender dysphoria, and the way that suffering greatly abates through transition, especially when transition happens in the context of love and acceptance. But along with those good things, I knew that transition was going to bring a lot of risks or a lot of suffering. And I had a lot of fear And as it turned out, like, not all of my fears materialized, but I was afraid that I would lose my wife and my family, not only my immediate family and my kids, but my extended families. I was convinced that people were likely to abandon me. I wouldn't have any friends. I was under no visions about what was going to happen with my pastoral career. I had hoped, I hoped for something different when the rubber hit the road, but it wasn't surprising that I had to resign. I was afraid of being a marginalized person. I remember talking to I had a gender coach for a while. I remember talking to her about, I'm afraid I'm going to be a freak. Everyone's going to see me as a freak. And, the loss of privilege, the loss of male privilege, the loss of white male privilege. I didn't know that I would become a political pariah like we have in the last year. But I was afraid of that. There were so many things. And in fact, in a part of going through these fears, my psychiatrist actually commented to me one day and drew out the metaphor of, like refugee status, and she kind of said, like, look, what you're going through, and she said this as like a thing to like, hey, give yourself a break, be gentle with yourself. She said, like, look, what you're going through is not, terribly unlike what people go through when they are, refugees of war. This experience is likely to upheave like every facet or many, many facets of your life. And so you're right to be afraid. You're right to be thinking of this as a trauma. This is blowing things apart. And so, I don't like, I think that one day I'd come to my appointment and was crying and was saying like, I'm such a freak. I cry all the time. And she was like, look, what you're going through is crazy. And so, and like I said, like some of the fears ended up materializing and other fears did not. Like to my shame, I still am connected with many people in my family who've been loving and accepting and wonderful. And I feel a little bit embarrassed about how I had assumed that they would bounce. But yet, not all those fears materialize. But here's the thing, even though I had this prospect of having, of essentially making a choice that would throw me into this refugee status, I was still like really seriously considering it. And maybe this is circular reasoning a little bit, but to me, the fact that I was willing to go through that suffering, or that I was, really consciously, honestly considering, making this choice that would blow up so much of my life, to me, that was yet another sign that like this is real in me, that I probably am transgender. And like, like I said, just like all the other ones, yeah, sure, in isolation, it could be reasoned away. And like I said, that might be circular reasoning in that case. But this is one of many, many items. Another one that I have on my list for tonight is the painfulness of transphobia. Over the years, I've heard, and I've talked some about this, many, many different forms of transphobia, whether they be in pop culture or from family members or at school or, like at church pastor meetings where people get up. I remember, being in meetings at the college that I used to work for, and people from administration would, get around and wring their hands and shriek about what was going to have to happen if they had to accommodate trans people in the dorms or in the bathrooms. And I remember those moments being so incredibly painful. And I always felt like I was uniquely aware of what was going on in this, and that I was uniquely aware of my dissent over the positions that were held by people in the room, and yet I was complicit because I never risked my status by speaking up. And, I understand why I did what I did. And I also feel some guilt for that. And that's my own process of, giving myself love while also owning that I wish to live differently now. But God, there's so many memories and stories where I stood by and heard people say the most awful, disgusting, transphobic things, homophobic things, misogynist, just nasty, awful things about people like me. And it always, long before I transitioned, long before I came out, all through my life, it's been so painful because I was trans all along. The last answer to that question tonight, and the last answer to that question on tonight's episode of Am I Transgender Part 4 is what I call in my notes, at least, the fruits of transition. This comes from the Bible, and there's this famous quote by Jesus where he says, by their fruits you will know them. And it's this idea, and I'm actually pulling it up on Google right now. It's from Matthew chapter 7. It's from the New King James. And it's part of this warning where he says, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they were ravenous wolves. He goes on, you will know them by their fruits, essentially saying, and that's the quote where he goes on and says, a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. So essentially, and then ends it with verse 20, chapter 7, verse 20 of Matthew, therefore by their fruits you will know them. Now, there's probably a million different interpretations of this text. The way that I interpret it is you can tell, like that part of like the validity of someone's teaching is borne out in how they live their lives. And so, when we see, whether it's a political person or we see a teacher or a religious leader, especially, this is specifically about religious leaders, or a business owner or whatever, when we see someone who, is putting themselves out there or teaching a certain thing or pushing a certain agenda, but their lives are rotten. I'm thinking of a certain, I'm thinking of Donald Trump, right? By the fruits, you will know them. We can tell that he's a fraud and a charlatan based on his behavior, based on what comes from it. Now, I apply this kind of idea to my own life in terms of, what's the outcome? What's the outcome for me of transition? What has it brought to my life? Obviously, there's been a lot of suffering. I've talked about that many times. There's been a lot of suffering. But at the same time, God, I am undoubtedly a better person. If you talk to my kids, if you talk to my wife, if you talk to anyone who knows me or knew me before and after, will say, you are so much calmer. You're so much more yourself. You're so much more in touch with what's going on in terms of your emotions. You are rageless. I can still get angry, but in terms of rage, it's far, far, far less. I am a better person. I'm more courageous. I'm more confident. I'm more kind. I put up with less shit, but do so in a more kind and loving and diplomatic way. I'm more comfortable drawing boundaries. I am more gentle to myself. I'm less depressed. I'm less anxious. Like the fruit, by their fruit, you will know them. Like the fruit of my transition has been so much beauty. You know, sometimes trans people talk about gender euphoria, right? So, gender dysphoria is pain and suffering and sadness and grief and discomfort associated with the gender roles that are projected onto us, the dysphoria with the body that we have, especially insofar as we associate gender to it. There's that sort of dysphoria, and on the other hand, like on the opposite end of that spectrum, some of us who are trans, now this isn't equally agreed upon, but some of us who are trans imagine euphoria being on the other end of that spectrum, where instead of feeling negative and sad about certain aspects or clothing or things we participate in, or bodily characteristics, or social habits, or whatever it happens to be, instead of feeling those negative things, we feel positive things. We feel joy and peace and satisfaction and contentment and alignment. It's euphoria. And gosh, for me, there's been a lot of euphoria that showed up along the way. And certainly, for me, dysphoria really spiked when I first came out, because it was like all the things that clocked me, all the things that led people to know that I was trans, or who looked down at, like, those things, really shot up in my mind's eye. But, along with that was somewhat of a gradual increase in feelings of that joy, peace, satisfaction, that feeling of gender euphoria, wearing clothes that I want to wear. Like, I just got this shirt and it like feels so cute and I love it. The back is really low. Like, it just feels wonderful in myself. And like growing out my hair and wearing accessories and getting my ears pierced and getting, tattooed on my arm. And, I remember one of the first nights, it was like maybe within a week or 2 weeks or something of coming out to, or I mean, it was maybe a little bit more than that. But anyway, when I came out to my wife, we went shopping for some feminine clothes at Target, and it was so much fun. It was like the funnest time shopping I'd ever had in my whole life. And I tried on everything, and she was there with me, and it felt safe because she was kind of watching out for us, even though I was presenting completely as a man. And I remember early on in my transition when people would call me ma'am, or they would refer to me as she. It felt so good. And, it still kind of stops me a little bit. That positive vibe, it still comes to me a little bit when I get she'd and heard and ma'amed and missed and so on. That's euphoria. It's the fruits. By their fruits you will know them. I wouldn't have experienced those flashes of joy without going through transition, and those flashes of joy reinforce my self-knowledge and my self-understanding that I am a trans person, and that I'm here and meant to live my life as a woman that I am. So there you go. Am I transgender? Part 4. I'll put the links to the previous 3 parts of this series. I will link those for you so that you will be able to go back and listen if you haven't done that yet. But thanks so much for spending the time with me, this half an hour, 40 minutes. I actually recorded a podcast episode with a friend of mine who has her own show, and that episode will be coming out in the coming weeks, and I may cross-post that when the time comes, so you can look forward to that. So this is actually the second episode I've recorded today, but I so appreciate your listening and your comments and ratings. I asked for you to go on and leave some ratings and stuff for to kind of counteract the homophobic haters that have been putting some 0-star reviews, especially in Apple podcasts. And you did it, and you're so wonderful. Thank you for doing that. A bunch of you went on and left reviews. It's so heartwarming to hear and to see that. I read every single one of your emails, and I do my best to reply. And it's just heartwarming to know that folks are out there and that this material is useful. I know that it's helpful for me, to reflect a little bit. So thanks for liking and subscribing and all the different things that you do. Thanks for sharing this on your social media feeds, if you're able. All the very best for you. My name is indeed Elle, and I'm a transgender woman talking.